Hey, it's Mark Marin from WTF here to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. And I'm sure the reason you're listening to this podcast right now is because you chose it. Well, choose Progressive's Name Your Price tool, and you could find insurance options that fit your budget, so you can pick the best one for your situation. Who doesn't like choice? Try it at Progressive.com. And now, some legal info. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
Welcome to episode number 249 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to say thanks to some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Preston C. Royer, Karen Frost, Claire Turner, Tammy Allison, Ember Bear, Nikki Hughes, Lisa Manning, Constance Shea, Betsy Ayres, Alessandro Cacciani, Kate, Sarah Russell, Renee Williamson, Alyssa Abney, Arlie, Benjamin Sawyer, Rihanna Amos, Lice, Melissa Carn, and Janine Rosen. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and I appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week, our film review is The Substance. The Substance was released in 2024. It has 7.6 out of 10 on IMDb and 91% on Rotten Tomatoes. Have you ever dreamt of a better version of yourself? You. Only better in every way. Seriously, you've got to try this new product. It's called The Substance. It changed my life. It generates another you. A new, younger, more beautiful, more perfect you. And there's only one rule. You share time. 1 week for you, 1 week for the new you. 7 days each. A perfect balance. Easy, right? If you respect the balance, what could possibly go wrong? I just really enjoyed that little synopsis. But to give you a more rounded synopsis, you've got an actress who is played by Demi Moore, who's doing these sort of Jane Fonda-like fitness TV shows. Anyway, she turns 50 and is sort of immediately like shunned. You know, it's sort of like, oh, well, you're too old for this now, babe. So we're going to get a new, younger version to take over your job. She's devastated. She decides to start taking this thing called The Substance, which essentially splits her in two. So there is a younger, like, you know, in inverted commas, hotter version of her, and then there is the 50-year-old version of her. And, you know, like the synopsis said, what could possibly go wrong? And I just have to say this before we start, okay? If I do not like a film that you feel passionate about, please do not send me long emails detailing why I didn't understand the film. Okay, because I promise you I understood the film. Films are subjective. People like some films, people don't like other films, and it's okay if we have differing opinions. So let's get into our likes and dislikes. I think you can already see where this film review is going to go. Firstly, I really was prepared to love this film, right? I kind of hadn't seen that much about it, but what I had seen about it, I was like, yes, I'm dying to see this. This feels like the type of feminist horror that I want to see. I went to see it with Sinead. We brought in some drinks because we were like, this is going to be rough. We're going to have to be prepared. And it's not that I wasn't entertained and didn't enjoy it. I just felt disappointed by it, you know? I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed. And I really liked the setup of this film. You have Demi Moore, who was this Hollywood superstar who is now doing Jane Fonda-esque fitness shows on TV. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And she is aging in this vapid, shallow world. So it's almost like she turns 50 and they just go, ooh, ew, you've turned 50, hideous. We don't want any more to do with that. No, sorry, no, you're not what we need anymore. And obviously, Demi Moore is an incredibly beautiful woman. She is gorgeous. She is stunning. And you're watching it going, this is insane that she's turned 50 and they've gone, no, we don't want to work with you anymore. We need a younger model. But actually, the world of aging, and I'm talking about this from a female perspective, obviously I'm not a man, the world of aging for women is all about how to keep looking younger rather than embracing the fact that people age and bodies change, etc., right? And there is such a good soundscape in this film. They use sound so effectively. It makes your skin crawl, it shocks you, and that, just the sound. There's this great moment in the beginning of the film where she goes to meet the exec of the TV station and he's eating prawns, and it's filmed in a way that is so stomach churning and skin crawling, like misophonia, eat your heart out. It is truly vile. But at the same time, it's this wonderful juxtaposition to what she has to present as, which is perfect, and her body is perfect, and she carries herself perfectly everywhere that she goes, and she's not sitting shoving prawns into her face loudly. It's just really, really well done. There is also a wonderful moment in this film where Demi Moore's character is meant to be going on a date, and she is standing in front of the mirror and she can't get her makeup right. And it honestly nearly reduced me to tears because it's getting later and later. The time is coming towards the date. She's scrubbing off her makeup, putting it back on again, getting really frustrated, getting really upset. She cannot get herself together. And I felt like this really small sequence, kind of relative to the rest of the film, really demonstrated something about trying to be perfect and look perfect and meet societal standards, and how hideously debilitating it can be when you don't feel like you look the way that you want to look. And I found it really heartbreaking, to be honest. There was also lots of hat tips to classic horror films from throughout the years, like The Shining, The Fly. That was cool. I thought that was clever and well done. And as you guys know, I'm not a fan of gore in horror films, and this is a body horror, so it is gory. However, I do not think the gore was unnecessary in this film. It's difficult to watch at times. You're watching and you're squirming in your chair and you're covering your eyes, but it's necessary because of the subject matter. They're talking about what women will sacrifice in terms of their bodies in order to achieve the body beautiful, the lengths that they will go to. So it makes sense that it's gory. I think it should be gory, and the gore to me didn't seem to be inappropriate. And I think watching this film, you need to be aware that the body horror element, like the last 15 minutes, is absolutely insane. It is batshit crazy. And I appreciated it. I thought it was really funny. Me and Sinead were rolling around the cinema laughing, but that could have been the margaritas. But still, we're going to move on to the dislikes, right? And as I said, I know that lots of people have loved this film, but I did have some issues with it. First of all, it was way too long. It was way too long. Right. You've got Demi Moore, then you've got Margaret Qualley, who plays the younger, hot version of Demi Moore. Demi Moore is obviously beautiful and incredibly attractive, so I just don't know if she was the best choice for this film to kind of get that point across, but whatever. I got it. We saw her young self living this glitzy life. We saw Demi Moore being sad and lonely and crying in her apartment. I got it. I did not need to see that cycled 50 times. I understood what was happening. I personally didn't think that either of their performances were standout, to be really frank. I didn't think that Demi Moore or Margaret Qualley was given the space and the grace to give a standout performance, because I think that their script and what we saw of them was shallow. It was hollow. Like I said, we saw glitzy life versus sad apartment life a million times. Why didn't we use that time to really dig down into those characters and really see how damaging beauty standards are? Why didn't we dig down and see how these characters relate to each other? Instead of seeing sad Demi and hot Margaret Qualley a million times, why didn't we see any bits of Demi Moore's character outside of her existence in this apartment? Like, why didn't we see what led her to this point in her career? Does she have any family or friends? Like, what is happening for her? And I do think that it's really important to have conversations about how damaging beauty standards can be, but I don't think this film actually had that conversation, really. There was so much shock and repulsive gore, right? And I understand why that was in there, but I don't think that's the only way that you can discuss that message. I don't think the only way to discuss how damaging beauty standards are is to show somebody's spine ripping open and show multiple shots of injections being given. That's not the only way to talk about beauty standards and aging in Hollywood. And also, I'm just going to say this, right? I don't know how much it was necessary to see perfect nude female bodies multiple times, and it was really highly sexualized views of the female body, right, continually. And we're talking about aging beauty standards in Hollywood, and we're seeing these bodies that are what society deems as perfect, what a lot of society deems as perfect, right? We're seeing those bodies highly sexualized again and again. To me, it felt like I was watching it through the male gaze. It felt like feminism through the male gaze. I was really reminded of when I went to see Sydney Sweeney in Immaculate, where there was all this conversation about how it was a film about female bodily autonomy and women taking back power over their bodies, yet we had these protracted scenes of hot, young, nude nuns bathing each other. I just feel like I wanted to see more of a real, meaningful exploration about aging and beauty standards, and I wanted to know more about the lives of Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley's characters. It was entertaining, like we really had a good time watching it, but it felt shallow. Like, I thought the characters themselves lacked so much substance, pun intended, that the film just became about bodies, which seems to be the very thing that it was meant to be preaching against. I'm giving it 3 stars. I do think it was entertaining. I enjoyed it. It was a real, true body horror. It hat-tipped a lot of, classic horror films. I think it's a really important thing to talk about in terms of beauty standards, but I don't think it's this feminist masterpiece that people are saying it is. And actually, fundamentally, I thought it was too long and quite shallow. Today's episode is sponsored by Uncommon Goods. Spark something uncommon this holiday with just the right gift from Uncommon Goods. Holiday season is almost upon us, I know. It flies around every year, and every year I try and be the best gift giver that I can be. I want to give gifts that spark joy and wonder and delight. I want people to look at the gifts that I get them and think, that is exactly what I wanted. And Uncommon Goods can make the whole process less stressful because they have incredible hand-picked gifts for everyone on your list. Uncommon Goods scour the globe for original, handmade and absolutely remarkable gifts. And I had a good look around the Uncommon Goods website, and there's stuff on there that I really adored. For example, they have a book lover's advent calendar, which is the perfect gift for the book lover in your life. There are also gifts galore for the people in your life who love crafting, or the people in your life who want to get into crafting. There are even a wealth of pickleball related gifts. Now, I didn't know what pickleball was, but now I do, and I'm interested. When you shop at Uncommon Goods, you are supporting artists and small independent businesses. The products are high quality, they are unique, they are often handmade, and they even have gifts that you can personalize. And guess what? With every purchase you make at Uncommon Goods, they give back $1 to a non-profit partner of your choice, and they have donated more than $3 million to date, which is pretty incredible. To get 15% off your next gift, go to uncommongoods.com/ghoststories. That's uncommongoods.com/ghoststories for 15% off. Do not miss out on this limited time offer. Uncommon Goods. We're all out of the ordinary.
The new Boost Mobile network is offering unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for life.
That sounds like a threat.
Then how do you think we should say it?
Unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month the rest of your life?
I don't know.
Until your ultimate demise.
What if we just say forever?
Okay.
$25 a month, forever.
Get unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month with Boost Mobile forever.
After 30 gigabytes, customers may experience slower speeds. Customers will pay $25 a month as long as they remain active on the Boost Unlimited plan.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
I have a secret. I used to struggle with dull, saggy skin. Then I found Spoiled Child's E27 liquid collagen. This extra-strength liquid formula, packed with type 1 and type 3 collagen, vitamin C, and hyaluronic acid, makes it so easy to visibly transform your skin and hair. No more chunky collagen powders, just a smooth, delicious liquid that can be blended with any drink. With over 100,000 five-star reviews, this liquid collagen is going viral for a reason. And with their try before you buy offer, you could try your full-size product at home before buying. Take the quiz at spoiledchild.com/quiz. That's spoiledchild.com/quiz. Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
Which brings us to our story this week. And our story this week, I mean, it's pretty clear. You can see in the title. We're talking about the Athens Lunatic Asylum. Let's dive straight into it. Athens, Ohio, now an American city with about 25,000 residents, came from humble beginnings. The first permanent European settlers didn't arrive there until 1797. Over a decade after the United States of America had won the Revolutionary War. But even by 1804, Athens was the home to Ohio University, making it one of the oldest public institutions of higher learning in the Northwest. It was actually this dedication to learning that gave the settlement of Athens its name, as it was named after the ancient Greek city of Athens, which was in turn named after the Greek goddess of learning, Athena. By 1811, Athens in Ohio was a humble village, and by the mid-1800s, it had turned into a hotbed of paranormal exploration and investigation. Many say that it all started with the Coons family, made up of Jonathan and Abigail Coons and their 9 children, who lived on their farm on Mount Nebo in Athens. Now, this short tale is a brief segue, but it is fascinating nonetheless. The Coons family of Athens County, a self-educated family of farmers, were drawn into the strange world of spiritualism in 1852, after Jonathan Coons read about the Fox family's mysterious rappings. Delving into seances across Ohio, Jonathan learned from the spirits that he and his wife Abigail, along with their eldest son Nahum, were natural mediums. Guided by spectral commands, they were instructed to construct a spirit room, a compact log cabin where otherworldly phenomena would soon unfold. Following the spirit's exact specifications, Jonathan built a cabin with a shuttered window, a single door, benches to hold 20 people, and a collection of musical instruments, including drums, fiddles, a trumpet, and a tambourine. Though Coons was far from wealthy, he acquired these items through a mix of borrowing and scrounging. At the spirit's demand, he suspended bells and copper-cut doves from the ceiling, setting the stage for what would become one of America's most infamous seances. Word of the Coons' spirit room quickly spread, And soon, locals and visitors from distant states gathered in this secluded Ohio Valley to witness the spectacle. The seance began with a thunderous bass drumbeat, compared by one witness to a cannon's blast. Jonathan would then play his fiddle, and as if by unseen hands, the remaining instruments would spring to life, circling the room in the pitch black. Instruments floated above the audience, dancing and playing melodies that no one recognized. One witness, Dr. G. Swan, recalled a tambourine brushing his hair one moment, only to flit across the room the next. Others reported instruments darting close to their faces, stirring both fascination and fear. But it was not Jonathan who led these ghostly concerts. A spirit known as John King directed the seance through an old tin horn, claiming to be the spirit of a long-dead Welsh buccaneer. King presided over an assembly of 165 spirits, each contributing to the performance with eerie melodies or unintelligible songs that seemed to come from something like human voices. The atmosphere was thick with suspense and terror, as many found themselves transfixed by the phantom's abilities. In the latter half of the seance, spectral hands appeared, some luminous, others clutching sheets of glowing paper. These hands felt cold to the touch and, to many, disturbingly lifelike. John Gage, a witness from Illinois, reported one of these hands playfully poking his nose as it scribbled messages on paper, moving so fast it was almost a blur. Several visitors held the hands and drew outlines of them, confirming that they were tangible yet strangely otherworldly, vanishing back into the dark after each encounter. The spirit room became renowned, drawing hundreds of people to Mount Nebo, which locals claimed was a haunted Shawnee burial ground. By 1858, the seances dwindled as other spiritual families set up their own spirit rooms nearby. Shortly after, the Coons left Ohio, abandoning their paranormal careers as suddenly as they had begun them. While Jonathan and Abigail's son Nahum continued to hold a quiet belief in spiritualism until his death, the family's story faded into obscurity. To this day, what truly happened in the spirit room remains a mystery. Witnesses offered no clear explanations, nor did they suggest any trickery. After all, the Coons charged no fee for their gatherings. Perhaps the question is not only how did they do it, but why they stopped, disappearing without a trace after 6 years of spectral fame. So Athens is imbued with a deep sense of the paranormal. And it was exactly on that land, steeped with this mystical energy, a place that was of great importance to the Shawnee tribe, a place where the Coons family had seemingly conjured up this army of spectres. This was the place that the Athens Lunatic Asylum would later be constructed. It was only a short while after the Coons began holding their public seances that the construction of the asylum would break ground on farmland belonging to Arthur Coates and Eliakim H. Moore. Following the design and influence of Dr. Thomas Kirkbride, the asylum caught its footing on a humble 141-acre property. With a focus on being outdoors and having physical work to do out in the open air, Dr. Kirkbride's philosophy encouraged the mentally ill to take part in farm work and skilled labour. Through its success, the Athens Lunatic Asylum grew to spread over 1,000 acres. From 1874 onwards, the asylum became the home and treatment centre of Civil War veterans, children and rebellious teenagers, but the most bolstered category of patients were the mentally unwell. These patients would be given jobs, either working with the livestock, on the gardens, or working in the fields. There was an orchard, a dairy farm, a workshop, and a power plant that generated steam heat. By the mid-1950s, the Athens Lunatic Asylum was the town's largest employer, with over 1,800 patients working on the grounds and providing services to over 15 other counties in Ohio. It was a win-win. The asylum provided mental health support and training programs to patients and economically and financially contributed to the state of Ohio. But that wasn't to say that the asylum itself was all benefits and no disadvantages. Given the time period when the hospital was built, very little was actually known about mental illnesses or what could really be done to treat them. The very first patient was a 14-year-old girl with epilepsy. It was a common belief at the time that epilepsy was caused by demonic possession. 31 men and 19 women would be admitted to the asylum that opening year for epilepsy alone. Then there were those who suffered from alcohol addiction, tuberculosis, and it was the women of the community who would find themselves admitted far more often than the men. Menopause, irregular menstrual cycles, postpartum depression, and hysteria were all reasons a woman could find herself admitted into the mental hospital. And that was not including the one female patient who was believed to have been driven insane from masturbation. With the growing number of patients and the expanding complex came an increasing variety of invasive treatments to subject them to. Electroshock therapy, hydrotherapy, and shackles became a common practice, as did the asylum's champion procedure, the lobotomy. It is a common word to hear nowadays, especially when discussing medical treatments that were available in the past. But that can also desensitize us to what a lobotomy truly entails. I'm going to offer up a trigger warning here, because this is difficult to hear. But this is what really happened. The procedure starts with a long metal pick being inserted between the eyeball and the eyelid of the patient until the pick touches the bone of the eye socket. Then the practitioner would take a mallet and hammer through the bone to gain access to the frontal lobe of the patient's brain. Then, using the pick in a sweeping motion, the frontal lobes are severed. All of this was usually done without anaesthesia, and some patients recorded experiencing pieces of their brains later draining out of their nose. Over 200 lobotomies were performed at the Athens Lunatic Asylum in only 4 years, and although many of the patients survived the procedure, they were not left unscathed. Many of them lost memories. Some of them experienced massive changes in their personalities. Some found that all of their emotions had become muted. Some could no longer speak or move. Some ended up taking their own lives as a result of the procedure. Most practicing and recommending lobotomies as a treatment were not necessarily trained medical professionals. In fact, most of the asylum's employees received little to no training. It was not the sprawling grounds and the working farms that people would associate with the asylum, but the suffering of its patients. What had once been viewed as a positive, peaceful addition to the town became a secretive, domineering warning and a threat to any seen to be delinquent in nature. And like many places that leave a foreboding and ominous impression on people's lives, some find it difficult to move on afterwards. Full-bodied apparitions of former patients are said to be seen wandering the halls. There have been reports of disembodied voices and screams, the sounds of gurneys with squeaky wheels and the rattling of chains. Some witnesses report seeing strange floating lights. Some report seeing and hearing the patients who had been locked away in the basement as punishment for their bad behaviour. It is perhaps no surprise that the asylum is where a good number of its patients met their end. But there is none who has their fate so infamously tied to the asylum than Margaret Schilling. Margaret was last seen on December the 1st, 1978. She was a 53-year-old woman, a wife and a mother. And though her records are still sealed and we don't know the reason why she was admitted to the Athens Lunatic Asylum in the first place, we do know that she wasn't considered a high-risk patient. Margaret had been there for some time by the winter of 1978. She was known to be friendly, but often preferred to be alone, and she would usually be seen standing on top of a set of stairs in the building, waving to the staff and other patients who walked by. That was because Margaret was a privileged patient. She was allowed to roam freely and was only expected back in her room at curfew. That was why, when doctors and other patients didn't see Margaret at her usual spot on top of the stairs the following morning, no one thought much of it. The day went on as usual. But that all changed when Margaret failed to show up for dinner. After that, the staff sounded the alarm and notified the local police that they had a missing patient. It wasn't uncommon for privileged patients to go missing. Many of them would end up walking out with their families or making their own way home, as they were usually high-functioning individuals. But it was the middle of winter, and the staff at the Athens Lunatic Asylum knew that if something had happened to Margaret and she was left stranded out in the cold, it was entirely possible that the worst could happen to her. The police and staff searched through the night, and Margaret made headlines the following morning. As Athens stood waiting to face one of its harshest winters yet, the entire community did what they could to find Margaret and bring her home safely. Days turned into weeks. And now, facing 30 inches of snow in places while they looked for Margaret, the police were forced to call the search off. With no signs of her and no signs that she had wandered off and gotten lost somewhere in the grounds, Margaret was considered to be a runaway patient, and it was everyone's hope that she was simply making her own way back to her family. But that was until January the 12th, 1979, 6 weeks after Margaret had last been seen. A vile smell had begun to spread through the building, leading staff up to the attic of a ward that was under construction. Staff had checked this attic multiple times during the search for Margaret. But in a twist of fate, this time, they would find her. Margaret was found frozen, her body completely naked and lying in a pool of sun from the window of the attic. Her clothes were neatly folded and stacked beside her. An autopsy concluded that she had died of heart failure as a result of hypothermia, and the case was closed. It was a sad chapter for the Athens Lunatic Asylum, but it was also a chapter that wasn't quite finished yet. Freezing at night and essentially baking during the day, Margaret had been left to decompose on the concrete floor of the attic. When the staff removed her remains for burial, they found that an impression of her body remained. A clear outline of Margaret, even down to the position her hair had been lying in, had been marked into the concrete beneath her. A mark that still won't wash away no matter how many times it has been cleaned. Witnesses claim to have seen Margaret's spirit watching them from the window of that attic, the same one that had provided sunlight to warm her freezing body. Some say that they have seen her, crying and screaming for help in terror as she realises that she will never escape that room. Some say that they see her happy and smiling as she waves from her usual spot on top of the staircase inside the building. But some say the fear that Margaret had felt as she died alone up in the room, and the anger that she experienced over not being found in time, has cursed the mark her remains left on the floor behind her. Touching that mark is believed to curse the toucher and will drive the person insane within a matter of days. To touch the mark has become a trial and a test, one that many Ohio University students find themselves facing at one point or another. But there's only one known case of a student actually accepting the challenge. Her name was Debbie Southall, and on Halloween night 1979, she not only broke into the attic where Margaret had died, but touched the mark on the concrete as well. Those around her say that something seemed to come over Debbie the next day. She became withdrawn and irritable, and would become enraged at the smallest things. Then a friend named Susan Harrington claimed to witness objects around Debbie, seemingly moving on their own as a shadowy figure appeared behind Debbie. It was after that Debbie became even more withdrawn and would often take to locking herself in her room for days at a time. She wouldn't come out, and she didn't seem to be eating or drinking either. After Debbie had locked herself in her room for a particularly lengthy amount of time, Susan became incredibly concerned and ended up breaking into Debbie's room. There, she discovered that Debbie had taken her own life, and her remains had left their own permanent mark on the floor underneath her. Whether this story is true or not, we do know that thousands of people died at the Athens Lunatic Asylum. There are 1,930 people still buried over the 3 cemeteries on the property. Most of them, 700 women and 959 men, were laid to rest under headstones marked only by their patient number, and not their names. These are the remains of patients who went unclaimed by the families, and though some were buried to later be moved to the family plots, most have remained, their names and lives lost to history. Shadowy figures are said to run through the cemeteries. Some witnesses claim to see them hiding behind trees. Others see them hiding behind the small, lopsided tombs, perhaps trying to tell us the identities of those who lie beneath them. In one of the cemeteries, the headstones form a circle, and rumours have it that it is an old witch's meeting spot. That is the story of the Athens Lunatic Asylum, at what some would argue to be the height of its paranormal history. The torture of patients, inhumane deaths, and curses imbue the property with chilling and lasting experiences of spirits and otherworldly entities. But some have argued that many of the phenomena that people have witnessed at the asylum have logical explanations behind them. Margaret, for example, a lot of speculation has been made around why she was found naked in the attic, especially when she had been discovered alone and frozen. Many point to the known condition called paradoxical undressing, where people suffering from hypothermia are essentially tricked by their own bodies into removing their clothes. And then there is the story of Debbie Southall being cursed after touching the mark left by Margaret's body. But retracing the steps of Debbie's story through newspaper articles show no initial reports of her having spent the night in the attic. In fact, the timeline places Debbie at Ohio University at the point in time when Margaret Schilling was very much still alive. Decades of stories and Ohio University history has merged the stories of Debbie and Margaret together, and in many cases, moulding fact into fiction and fiction into fact. And the 1970s, when both Margaret and Debbie's stories were forming, was right in the middle of what would be the end of the Athens Lunatic Asylum. The 1950s had seen a drastic change in the approach to mental illness, and it became much more common practice to treat patients at home than separating them from society. Mental hospitals like the one in Athens suddenly found themselves underfunded and running out of both possible revenue streams and patients. And the public perception of procedures like lobotomies, electroshock therapy and hydrotherapy put the final nail into the coffin. Now, no longer being perceived as miracle cures, the average person realised that these forms of treatment were cruel and inhumane. As people increasingly turned to medicines to treat their mental health, the Athens Lunatic Asylum was forced to close its doors. In 1993, the deed to the property was gifted to the Ohio University, who have renovated it and put it to use ever since. Now rebranded as The Ridges, what was Athens Lunatic Asylum is now a mixture of offices, classrooms, galleries and theatres. And since then, the university and the National Alliance on Mental Illness have been working on restoring the cemeteries and recovering the identities of the people who have been buried within them. The hope is to give every resident who calls the grounds of the former asylum their final resting place, their name and their humanity back. I try not to do stories of lunatic asylums too often because, quite like witch trials, they often follow the same pattern. An asylum is established, it is built, it becomes far too big too quickly, they expand it exponentially, they still take on too many patients, they begin doing lobotomies and hydrotherapy, etc., etc. People go, oh, actually, this probably isn't great, and then the asylum is ultimately shut down. I think it is impossible to imagine that there isn't some indelible mark left on these buildings because of the years of suffering and torment that the patients in these establishments went through. Now, fundamentally, a huge number of these patients would be suffering and in torment because of the nature of their illness. But there's also the added layer of how they were treated, overcrowding conditions, the fact that patients with all different issues and of all different ages and genders were often lumped in together, which is completely inappropriate. I also think it's important to point out that the thinking is that more women were thrown into asylums for much kind of more frivolous reasons than men. However, there are a lot more men that are buried in the Ridges than there are women. And I was kind of thinking about why that is. Is it that men were more likely to be admitted when they were physically ill? Or is it that women were more likely to be admitted and then released and not necessarily kept for a lifetime? There is clearly some sort of nuance there, but it is historically true that women were incarcerated, that they were locked up in asylums for the most obscure reasons, which included hysteria and, having periods and, in this instance, masturbating too much. And we do kind of laugh at the flippancy of these incidences, and some of them are offered without context, and actually when you kind of dig into them, the wider context actually does suggest that an asylum was where this person should be, but oftentimes it wasn't where they should be, not in the slightest. I came across a story recently on TikTok which kind of, I think, highlights this really well, and it's not very long, don't worry, but it was a girl who had worked in a mental health institution for older people. So it was a nursing home, but specifically for people with mental health difficulties. And she had a patient who was just an older woman, and this older woman was said to be delusional, that she suffered from psychotic delusions. And so this new member of staff was encouraged to sit down and read all the files of all the different patients and really kind of familiarise herself with their pathology and their stories. And she was reading the file of this woman, and it was sad. This woman had been grieving. She'd been really struggling with her grief, and she'd ended up seeing a psychologist or psychiatrist, I can never remember which one, and she had regular sessions with this man and developed a psychotic delusion that she and this man were having a full-blown relationship. They were in love, they were going to run away together, etc., etc. Eventually, the psychiatrist and the husband decided the best thing to do would be to have her sectioned because of these delusions. And these delusions continued. She remained convinced that her and this psychiatrist had been in a full-blown relationship, and so on. And this member of staff was reading these notes and thinking, oh, this is so sad, this poor woman. And then she was doing her rounds one day, and this woman said to her, oh, come, I want to show you something, come into my room. So she went into the room, and this woman pulled out a box, a memory box, and showed her all these letters that she said were from the love of her life. And the member of staff immediately recognised the handwriting, and the handwriting was that of the psychiatrist that this woman had said she was in a relationship with, and she had been branded as delusional and sectioned because of it. And this member of staff said it was very clear from these letters. The handwriting was a complete absolute match. It was clearly letters between this psychiatrist and this patient, that they had been in a relationship. And because obviously for the psychiatrist, if he had been discovered as having a relationship with this woman, he would have likely lost his job and, lost his license to practice, etc. So she had been sectioned instead. Now, this woman at this point was very elderly, and this had happened decades and decades ago. But it just goes to show people ended up in these institutions that did not need to be there. And I could rant about this all day, but I'm not going to. I promise I'm not going to. But it is also important to point out that the conditions in these places was pretty much universally horrendous. The conditions were horrendous. There were some outlying facilities who actually, had good facilities and patients were treated as best as they could, etc. But for the most part, these facilities, the conditions were absolutely appalling. There is a documentary that is available on YouTube called Silent Minority, which was how people with intellectual disabilities were facilitated in institutions in the UK. It is horrendous to watch, but it happened. There was also Willowbrook, The Last Great Disgrace, which was released in 1972, and it was an expose of a mental institution called Letchworth. And it was a journalist called Geraldo Rivera who exposed what was actually happening inside these institutions. Again, absolutely harrowing to watch, but this stuff really did happen. And I often wonder if stories like the stories of these old lunatic asylums, the haunting stories, the stories of ghosts and demons and shadow figures and blah, 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 if those stories take over these asylums because it is too unbearable to really look at how we treated other human beings in these buildings in the past. Sometimes it is much easier to explore these horrors through supernatural horror rather than actually the cold horror that is human nature. And the last ranty thing that I'm going to say is that electroshock therapy is still in use to this day. It's now called electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, and I mean it fundamentally follows the same pattern that we see in horror films and films like, I think it's in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and stuff. Like, it still follows the same pattern. You shock the brain with surges of electricity and it causes seizures and convulsions. It is still used in really extreme cases of things like catatonic depression, although there are calls for it to be banned. Okay, that is my rant aside. Let's dive into the actual story. So I knew nothing about the Coons Spirit Room. It's not something I've ever come across, but I am immediately obsessed with this story and I need to do a deep dive into it, and I need to do like a full main episode on it because it's crazy. And I must say my immediate response is, it's amazing that they did all of these like seances in the pitch dark, first of all. And at the beginning, I said there were 9 children in this family, and yet it is only the eldest boy who takes part in these seances. Where are the other 8 children at this time? And isn't it weird that we have all these tiny, spooky, ghostly, cold hands that people keep experiencing that feel very real and lifelike. And in the witness testimonies about this spirit room, people are like, and there was all these voices, and some of them spoke in language we didn't understand, and they were kind of otherworldly and weird. Where are the 8 children? I don't mean to be super cynical about this, but I'm not entirely sure I believe that this family had some sort of ghost orchestra built in a shed in their garden. And people travelled really long distances to come to this spirit room, which wasn't easy at that period of time. And there is obviously the point that they took no money for this, so therefore it must be real. Is it? I don't know. Secondly, there is also the fact that, people didn't question whether it was real or not at the time. Nobody suggested it was a hoax, but that all depends on who's in the room. If you are somebody who's in that room because you want your own beliefs to be validated, you are not going to suggest that this is a hoax. And if you have built a spirit room in your back garden, then you have greater control over who gets to be in that room. I also could not imagine anything worse than a load of ghosts all playing different melodies on different instruments at the same time, all singing different songs. Some of them are playing drums, some of them are blowing into trumpets. Oh, I could not think of a worse noise. To be honest, I'd probably pay the family not to have to go into the shed. And in relation to the allegedly this mountain being important to the Shawnee tribe of Native Americans, I couldn't find any link between Mount Nebo and the Shawnee tribe. That is not to say there isn't one. I'm just saying that I couldn't find an obvious one. I couldn't find any kind of articles or documents that say, Mount Nebo is a sacred space for the Shawnee tribes, or they, built effigies there or whatever. I couldn't find anything like that, and that's not to say that it isn't, but I just couldn't find any kind of obvious evidence of a link between them. I would, however, recommend that you look up pictures of the ridges, or the Athens Lunatic Asylum as it was known. It's a pretty huge, sprawling set of buildings. It's enormous. And I do respect the origins of the Athens Lunatic Asylum in that there was this movement towards lots of outside labour and manual labour and working on skills and developing skills as good therapy for your brain. So I think initially the seeds of kind of positive intervention were there. But as these institutions grew and, more complex cases were taken on, etc., that positive intervention often just went out the window. And it's like I've said a million times, if negative energy can hang around in a place, it makes sense that it would hang around in places like the Athens Lunatic Asylum. I also wonder how much of these stories are based on priming. People go to the Athens Lunatic Asylum, or they are there in the ridges because they're working there, or they're using the facilities, and the stories of what happened in that place over decades. You know those stories. You know how horrible it was. You've heard the stories of the hauntings. Then does something that is actually has a logical explanation, does that become the squeaking wheels of a gurney? Does the sound of a vixen in the woods become the distant screams of a patient in the basement? It's so difficult to know when a building has such a rich and traumatic history. And in relation to the story of Margaret, I mean, it's such a sad story, and you can look up pictures of Margaret, and you can also look up pictures of the stain that was allegedly left on the ground by her body. They're very freely available on Google. Thing is, it does look like the shape of a female body. It does. That is what it looks like. There's no denying that. And her story is incredibly sad. And like I said in the main episode, there have been lots of people who have been like, why were her clothes taken off? And, why were they folded up neatly beside her? I mean, like I said, hypothermia tricks your brain into thinking that you're overheating, and people would often take off their clothes in a panic when they're suffering from hypothermia. I also wondered, if it's a cold winter, I wonder if she had realised that in this attic, it was like a little sauna, like a sun trap. And during the day, you could be up there and be really warm. And what if she was lying in that little sun trap, genuinely sunbathing? And then for whatever reason, she became unable to move. Maybe she had some sort of cardiac episode. Maybe it was as simple as her falling asleep. But the story is devastating. It feels really, really sad. And then, of course, intertwined with that, you have this story of Debbie Southall, that she broke into the attic and she touched the stain that had been left on the floor. And then as a result, she, went mad and eventually took her own life. And her own stain was left on the floor, etc., etc. And we see this all the time with paranormal stories, is that stories of ghosts and paranormal activity and curses become intertwined with stories of real tragedies that happen in the community, and the fact that dates overlap and don't make sense, etc., that becomes irrelevant, because the truth should never get in the way of a good story. And I spoke about this recently on Patreon in relation to alleged cursed phone numbers. I do sometimes think when there is an untimely death, or a death that is shocking, or you see somebody who is going about their life and seems to be mentally absolutely fine, and then they slip into a serious depression, or they slip into psychosis, or their behavior changes, etc., etc. Sometimes it's easier to frame that within a spooky story than to accept the fact that A, people die in tragic circumstances, that B, sometimes people die really young, and that C, our mental health is sometimes fragile, and things can happen that cause people to display serious mental health difficulties when previously they seemed to have been mentally very healthy. There is so much content out there about the Ridges, previously Athens Lunatic Asylum, and I am aware that we've talked about some pretty dark topics in this episode, but I do think it's important to recognise that these stories have a very particular context, and that context is centred in human suffering, and very real human suffering. And we often throw around phrases like, I should be lobotomized, or, variations of that. And I think it's important to always keep in mind that not only did lobotomies really happen, but they happened to real people. They were incredibly brutal, and they happened without any anaesthetic and without any real thought to what the consequences would be. God, that was a very serious episode, wasn't it? Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Real Life Ghost Stories. If you would like to send in your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.